Mark Rutte described the Brussels meeting as a leap forward and said the defence ministers will agree on an ambitious new set of capabilities to target or rather keep deterrence strong. What is the strategic significance of these new NATO capability targets, and how prepared is really Europe to meet them?
Well, first of all, good afternoon to you and good afternoon to my colleague in Paris. You said it, the Secretary General said it was a leap forward. I think it's an edge forward. It follows a procedure which has been of long standing in NATO, in the alliance, of trying to plan for military capabilities, what the military capabilities of NATO might look like in the following 5 years, and to try to match that with resources. But the problem is the resources that Mr. Trump has demanded is too much. He's demanded the money before the capabilities. And of course, what the Europeans want to know is not whether the United States can be relied on solely, but what is the contribution of the United States? Then the Europeans can plan accordingly. But unfortunately, Mr. Trump wants to be ambiguous and wants to threaten the allies, and that's what is making the pressure and also the dangers to the cohesion of NATO.
Okay, on that note, Mr. Fazeli, the US Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, had skipped the Ukraine contact group. This is part of also the ambiguous plan, I'm assuming. What message does this send to the NATO allies and to Russia?
I think that the main problem today is that, as Mao Zedong, or as Xu Enlai, to be precise, said about Soviet Russia and America in a very ironic way in the early 70s, and he was saying they sleep in the same bed, but they don't share the same dreams. And that's exactly the situation we have now between Western European NATO member states, the big players, the big boys, and that would be essentially Germany, Britain, and France. What they say, what they do determines what the other European NATO members do. And at any rate, the other European members are much smaller. So when we talk about NATO in Europe, it's essentially London, Berlin, and Paris, right? Mm-hmm. And today, their worldview is very different from the Trump White House. It wasn't the case 8 years ago in the first Trump administration, because let's not forget, 8 years ago, when Trump came to power, many important members of his cabinet were actually neoconservative, pro-NATO Republicans. Fast forward today, Trump has completely decimated the neoconservative pro-NATO wing of his party, the Republican Party. And what's fascinating today, who do we have in Brussels representing America? Pete Hegseth. So in essence, Pete Hegseth, he's an apostate. So he's a former neocon who stopped believing in NATO and neocon thinking, exactly like Marco Rubio. So the only surviving former neocons present today in the Trump administration are apostates who have abandoned publicly.
So why do you think there was a shift in the mindset of the Trump, from today's Trump from his previous term?
Yeah, because today these people are no longer neocons. But they are neorealists, right?
So his shift is due to his surrounding, the people around him, or is it just Trump?
It's his thinking. So Trump was always a neorealist, but initially he wasn't able to completely impose his worldview on the Republican Party. Fast forward today, it's very different. He was able to completely transform the Republican Party, and he imposed his worldview. And his worldview, quite frankly, are indifferent or hostile to NATO. Why are America's neorealists indifferent or hostile to NATO? Very simply because they focus on the Asia-Pacific area. They think that the Asia-Pacific area, China, are essential, that the techno-industrial race pitting Beijing against Washington is the main issue, and all other issues are secondary, right? And so that's why they have, quote unquote, abandoned Ukraine, because to them, Ukraine and Central Europe are of no big strategic value in that big race against China.
Yes.
Russia for them is no longer a superpower, but they believe, the Americans believe, that Russia is an important pivot nation, and that's why they believe they need to have good relations with Russia to keep it neutral in that new Cold War pitting America against China. So to make a long story short, they have shifted to a completely new worldview. The Europeans, however, the French, the Brits, the Germans, are clinging desperately to the old worldview. One last point I want to make, that the defense ministers or the prime ministers in most of these countries, including Germany, Boris Pistorius, he's a social democrat. John Healey, the UK defense minister, is also a Labour social democrat. Macron is also a center-left social democrat. So all these people
Different
who love
perspectives,
NATO,
yes.
who support NATO, are culturally and politically completely opposed to everything Trump stands for.
So if we can get Mr. Williams' response here as well, what do you think of what Mr. Fazeli just said about, the perspective of the Trump administration and how they're handling NATO and, the lack of importance or focus that they want when it comes to Europe and NATO? Do you agree with this?
I agree largely, but I do think there's an element of what people call transactionalism in Trump's attitude to Europe. Europe is facing three challenges from Trump. The first is economic with the tariffs. The second is security in terms of what strength will the transatlantic and what shape will the transatlantic link take for the future. And the third one is defense against Russia, primarily in Ukraine. And that some analysts believe that Trump is holding out the ambiguity of his attitude on these three issues in order to maximize the benefits, so-called economic, security, and defense for the United States. So it's whether he has a worldview, I don't know, but he does have a view which is transactional and wants to maximize, in his terms, the business economic opportunities.
But sir, Mr. Williams, do you think that, as you said, he's transactional? Now, he is expecting a 5% increase when it comes to defense spending on NATO. Do you think that the Europeans are going to be able to meet this demand?
No, of course not. But what the Europeans do, and this is the whole business about behind Mark Rutte's, the Secretary General of NATO's proposal, is smoke and mirrors. They will, as your introduction explained, they want to do 3.5%, commit NATO to 3.5% by 2032, and the other 1.5% will be negotiated in time after the NATO summit. But the headline will be, yes, we're committed to 5%. Look, some NATO countries, Canada, Belgium, have not even attempted to meet the 2%, and they will be promising to meet the 5%, however configured. So the answer to it is no, but they believe that smoke and mirrors will allow Trump to say, I've achieved what no other president has achieved before.